Behind the walls of America's most secure prison, something unprecedented was about to unfold. The man who once commanded armies of sicarios, who built tunnels beneath international borders, who escaped from maximum security facilities twice, was about to receive news that would shatter even his legendary composure. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was about to learn that his wife had been taken, not by federal agents, not by rival cartels from Mexico, but by a Venezuelan criminal organization that had just declared war on his entire bloodline. This isn't just another story about cartel violence. This is about the moment when the most feared drug lord in history realized that his empire had crumbled so completely that even his family was no longer safe. And what happened next inside that concrete tomb they call ADX? Florence would reveal just how far a caged king will go when his queen is captured by enemies he never saw coming. The morning started like any other in the Alcatraz of the Rockies. El Chapo followed his rigid routine, the same mechanical existence that had defined his days since arriving at the Supermax facility. 23 hours of solitude, 1 hour of exercise in a concrete cage barely larger than a dog kennel, and the constant surveillance of guards who treated him like a museum exhibit rather than a human being. But on this particular morning, everything changed with a single phone call to his legal team. Emma Coronel Aispuro, the former beauty queen who had stood by Chapo through 2 dramatic prison escapes and a Hollywood-worthy trial, had vanished. Not disappeared in the way that people go missing in Mexico, where bodies turn up in mass graves or hanging from highway overpasses. She had been extracted, taken by operators who knew exactly what they were doing, and had the resources to pull off an international kidnapping without leaving a trace. The Venezuelan cartel behind her abduction wasn't some ragtag group of street dealers. These were the successors to Hugo Chavez's criminal networks, organizations that had evolved from political corruption into full-scale narco-terrorism. They controlled cocaine routes from Colombia through the Caribbean, managed money laundering operations that rivaled Swiss banks, and had recently begun expanding their influence into Mexican territory that had traditionally belonged to the Sinaloa cartel. For months, intelligence agencies had been tracking increased Venezuelan presence in traditional Sinaloa strongholds. What started as business partnerships for cocaine trafficking had gradually transformed into something more aggressive. The Venezuelans weren't content to be junior partners in the drug trade. They wanted to control the entire supply chain from production in South America to distribution in North American cities. Emma's capture represented more than just a kidnapping. It was a calculated psychological warfare operation designed to send a message directly to El Chapo himself. The Venezuelans knew that taking his wife would accomplish something that federal prosecutors, military operations, and rival Mexican cartels had never achieved. They would make the legendary escape artist feel completely powerless while trapped in a cage he could never break free from. The details of how they managed to locate and capture Emma remain classified, but sources within the intelligence community suggest that the operation took months of planning. The Venezuelan cartel had been monitoring her movements since her release from federal prison, tracking her through surveillance networks that extended far beyond what most people realize criminal organizations are capable of achieving. What makes this situation even more disturbing is that Emma wasn't just grabbed off the street by random criminals. According to intercepted communications that have been partially declassified, the Venezuelan operatives knew intimate details about her daily routine, her security arrangements, and even her communication methods with El Chapo's legal representatives. This level of intelligence gathering suggests that someone with access to highly classified information was feeding details to the Venezuelan cartel. Inside ADX Florence, the news reached El Chapo through his attorney during what should have been a routine legal consultation. Prison officials who witnessed the meeting reported that his reaction was unlike anything they had ever observed from him. The man who had remained stoically silent through his extradition, who had shown no emotion during his trial, who had accepted his life sentence without visible reaction, suddenly became animated in ways that concerned even the most experienced correctional officers. According to sources who spoke anonymously to investigative journalists, El Chapo's first response wasn't anger or desperation. It was laughter. Not the kind of laughter that indicates amusement, but the cold, calculating laughter of someone who has just realized that all pretenses are off and that the rules of engagement have fundamentally changed. Prison staff reported that he spent several minutes laughing before his expression shifted to something far more unsettling. The transformation that followed would be described by one guard as watching someone flip a switch from human to something else entirely. El Chapo began speaking rapidly in Spanish, not to his attorney, but apparently to himself, repeating phrases that translators later identified as planning terminology used by military tacticians. He was strategizing. What every protocol next violates is the ADX Florence had established for high-risk inmates. El Chapo demanded immediate access to communication channels that had been denied to him since his arrival. He wanted to contact not just his legal team, but specific individuals whose names appeared on federal watch lists. When prison officials refused these requests, his behavior escalated in ways that forced them to implement emergency containment procedures. The Venezuelan cartel's timing for this operation was particularly calculated. They had waited until El Chapo's sons were dealing with their own legal troubles, until his traditional allies in the Sinaloa cartel were distracted by territorial disputes, and until his influence within Mexican criminal networks had been weakened by years of imprisonment. They struck when they believed he was most vulnerable and least capable of retaliation. But they underestimated something crucial about El Chapo's character. Throughout his criminal career, he had demonstrated an ability to maintain power and influence, even when physically removed from day-to-day operations. His 2 previous escapes from Mexican maximum security prisons hadn't been solo efforts. They had required coordination between dozens of people, millions of dollars in bribes, and planning that took place over months while he was supposedly under the highest levels of security. The Venezuelan cartel's assumption that capturing Emma would simply psychologically devastate El Chapo revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how he operates. Rather than breaking his spirit, the kidnapping appeared to activate something that had been dormant during his years of imprisonment. Prison officials noted that his entire demeanor shifted from resigned acceptance to active engagement with his circumstances. Within hours of learning about Emma's disappearance, El Chapo had submitted formal requests for expanded legal consultations, additional phone privileges, and access to documentation that had previously been restricted. When these requests were denied, he began employing tactics that demonstrated his understanding of the American legal system was far more sophisticated than anyone had realized. The ripple effects of his reaction began spreading beyond the walls of ADX Florence almost immediately. Intelligence agencies monitoring cartel communications intercepted increased chatter about potential retaliation operations. Mexican law enforcement reported unusual movement patterns among known Sinaloa cartel associates. And most concerning of all, Venezuelan authorities began reporting attacks on their own criminal networks' operations in South America. The evidence that El Chapo wasn't just emotionally reacting but strategically mobilizing became impossible to ignore when federal monitoring systems detected something unprecedented. Communication patterns that had remained dormant for years suddenly crossed multiple continents. Phone numbers that hadn't been active since his capture were pinging cellular towers from Culiacan to Caracas. Bank accounts frozen since 2017 showed microtransactions that suggested someone was testing whether the financial networks were still operational. What the Venezuelan cartel had failed to understand was that El Chapo's power had never been centralized in his physical presence. His empire was built on a web of relationships, favors, and carefully maintained loyalties that could be activated even from the deepest isolation. The man who had once tunneled his way to freedom twice wasn't going to accept his wife's kidnapping as an inevitable consequence of his imprisonment. Prison surveillance footage from ADX Florence revealed behavior that concerned security experts who had spent decades managing the most dangerous criminals in America. El Chapo began requesting specific books from the prison library, titles that seemed innocuous but contained information about South American geography, Venezuelan political history, and international banking regulations. He wasn't just educating himself about his enemies, he was preparing for something. The most disturbing development came when intelligence agencies discovered that the Venezuelan cartel's operation wasn't as isolated as initially believed. Emma's kidnapping was part of a broader strategy to destabilize the traditional power structures that had governed international drug trafficking for decades. The Venezuelans weren't just targeting El Chapo's family, they were systematically going after the wives, children, and extended relatives of multiple Mexican cartel leaders. This revelation transformed what appeared to be a personal vendetta against El Chapo into something far more serious. The Venezuelan cartel was attempting to revolutionize how criminal organizations operated by demonstrating that no one, regardless of their position or protection, was untouchable. They were trying to prove that the old rules of engagement, the unwritten codes that had prevented total warfare between criminal organizations, were obsolete. Federal agents monitoring the situation realized they were witnessing the beginning of what could become an international criminal conflict unlike anything in modern history. The Venezuelans had the backing of corrupt government officials, military-grade weapons, and financial resources that rivaled small nations. The Mexican cartels had decades of operational experience, established smuggling networks, and a willingness to engage in violence that knew no boundaries. El Chapo's response to this escalating situation demonstrated why he had become legendary even among his criminal peers. Rather than allowing the Venezuelan cartel to dictate the terms of engagement, he began orchestrating a response that would force them to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. His requests for legal consultations weren't just about understanding his wife's situation. He was using attorney-client privilege to coordinate activities that federal agencies could monitor but couldn't legally intercept. The sophistication of his prison communications became apparent when coded messages began appearing in seemingly routine legal documents. Federal prosecutors who had spent years studying his methods recognized patterns in the language that suggested he was issuing specific instructions to operatives who were still loyal to him. These weren't desperate attempts to maintain relevance. They were calculated military-style orders being transmitted through the American legal system itself. Mexican authorities reported that within 72 hours of Emma's disappearance, Venezuelan cartel operations throughout Mexico came under coordinated assault. Safe houses were raided, money laundering operations were exposed to law enforcement, and key Venezuelan operatives began disappearing in ways that suggested professional elimination rather than random violence. Someone with intimate knowledge of Venezuelan criminal networks was systematically dismantling their infrastructure. The retaliation wasn't limited to Mexico. Intelligence agencies detected unusual activity in Colombian ports where Venezuelan cartels operated cocaine trafficking operations. Shipping containers that should have contained legitimate cargo were being intercepted by authorities who seemed to have received remarkably accurate intelligence about their contents. Bank accounts in Panama and the Cayman Islands that had been funding Venezuelan criminal enterprises were suddenly frozen by financial institutions, citing compliance concerns. What made these operations particularly impressive was their coordination and timing. The attacks on Venezuelan cartel interests weren't random acts of revenge. They were strategically planned operations that targeted the most vulnerable aspects of the Venezuelan criminal enterprise while avoiding collateral damage that might attract unwanted government attention. Someone was orchestrating a shadow war with the precision of a military campaign. Federal agents monitoring El Chapo's communications with his legal team noticed that his demeanor had shifted from the desperate urgency of someone whose family was in danger to the cold professionalism of someone executing a carefully planned strategy. He was no longer reacting to events. He was controlling them from a concrete cell that was supposed to make him powerless. The Venezuelan cartel's confidence in their operation began showing cracks when their own communications networks came under attack. Encrypted messaging systems they had considered secure were compromised in ways that suggested someone with advanced technical capabilities was targeting their infrastructure. Phone numbers they had used for years suddenly became unreliable. Financial transactions that should have been invisible to law enforcement were being flagged by banking security systems. But the most psychologically devastating aspect of El Chapo's response was how he managed to turn the Venezuelan cartel's own tactics against them. Just as they had kidnapped Emma to send him a message, he began orchestrating operations that would send them a message they couldn't ignore. Venezuelan cartel leaders who had felt secure in their South American strongholds began experiencing the same sense of vulnerability they had tried to inflict on their Mexican rivals. Intelligence reports suggested that El Chapo's network had managed to identify and target family members of key Venezuelan cartel leadership, not for kidnapping or violence, but for surveillance and psychological pressure that made it clear that their loved ones were no longer safe anywhere in the world. The message was unmistakable. If you want to play games with families, we can play that game better than you ever imagined. The escalation reached a critical point when Venezuelan authorities reported that several high-ranking cartel members had gone into hiding, abandoning operations that had taken years to establish. The confidence that had driven their expansion into Mexican territory was evaporating as they realized they had provoked an enemy who could reach them anywhere in the world, even while imprisoned in America's most secure facility. El Chapo's transformation from a caged criminal to an active strategic commander revealed something that federal prosecutors had never fully understood about his character. His power had never been dependent on his freedom. It had been built on his ability to inspire absolute loyalty among people who were willing to risk everything to serve his interests. That loyalty hadn't disappeared when he was imprisoned. It had simply been waiting for him to activate it. The psychological warfare between El Chapo and the Venezuelan cartel had evolved into something far more dangerous than anyone anticipated. What started as a kidnapping designed to humiliate the imprisoned drug lord had transformed into a chess match where every move carried life and death consequences for criminal organizations spanning 3 continents. And El Chapo was proving that even behind the walls of America's most secure prison, he could still play the game better than anyone else. Intelligence analysts monitoring the situation began to realize they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of organized crime. El Chapo wasn't just coordinating retaliation against his wife's kidnappers. He was orchestrating a systematic dismantling of Venezuelan criminal operations that demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that rivaled military commanders. Every attack on Venezuelan interests was precisely calculated to cause maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. The sophistication of his response became apparent when federal investigators discovered that multiple Venezuelan cartel safe houses had been compromised simultaneously across different countries. These weren't random hits by angry sicarios seeking revenge. These were coordinated intelligence operations that required advanced planning, detailed reconnaissance, and access to information that should have been impossible for a man locked in solitary confinement to obtain. What made El Chapo's counteroffensive particularly devastating was how he managed to exploit the Venezuelan cartel's own expansion strategy against them. Their aggressive push into traditional Sinaloa territory had required them to establish new operational bases, recruit local personnel, and create financial networks in unfamiliar locations. These expansion efforts, which should have been sources of strength, became vulnerabilities when someone with intimate knowledge of cartel operations began targeting them systematically. Prison officials at ADX Florence noticed that El Chapo's behavior had stabilized into a pattern that concerned security experts. Rather than the emotional volatility they expected from someone whose family was in danger, he displayed a cold professionalism that suggested he was operating according to a predetermined plan. His legal consultations became longer and more frequent, but the content remained protected by attorney-client privilege in ways that frustrated federal monitoring efforts. The breakthrough in understanding his methods came when intelligence agencies identified a pattern in seemingly unrelated criminal activities across Latin America. Bank accounts that had been dormant for years were suddenly activated with small transactions that appeared to be testing whether the financial networks were still operational. Communication channels that federal agencies had assumed were defunct, carrying encrypted messages between known cartel associates. Safe houses that authorities believed had been abandoned showed signs of renewed activity. What federal investigators realized was that El Chapo had maintained what intelligence experts called deep cover assets throughout his criminal network. These were individuals who had remained completely inactive since their imprisonment, living normal lives while waiting for orders that might never come. The Venezuelan cartel's attack on his family had activated these sleeping operatives, transforming them from ordinary citizens back into instruments of his will. The Venezuelan cartel's leadership began experiencing the same psychological pressure they had tried to inflict on El Chapo. Intelligence reports indicated that several high-ranking members had relocated their families to secure locations, abandoned established residences, and increased their personal security details. The confidence that had driven their expansion into Mexican territory was being replaced by paranoia, as they realized they were fighting an enemy who could strike anywhere at any time. Mexican authorities reported unusual patterns in cartel violence that suggested a new level of strategic coordination. Instead of the random brutality that typically characterized conflicts between criminal organizations, the attacks on Venezuelan interests followed a systematic approach that targeted key infrastructure while avoiding collateral damage that might provoke government intervention. Someone was applying military-style tactics to criminal warfare in ways that law enforcement had never encountered. The most disturbing aspect of El Chapo's campaign was how he managed to weaponize the legitimate legal and financial systems against his enemies. Venezuelan laundering operations that cartel money had operated successfully for years suddenly found their bank accounts frozen due to compliance investigations. Shipping companies that had unknowingly transported Venezuelan cocaine began receiving anonymous tips about their clients' criminal activities. Border security agencies across multiple countries received detailed intelligence about Venezuelan smuggling routes. Federal agents monitoring the situation realized that El Chapo had somehow managed to access intelligence networks that extended far beyond traditional criminal organizations. The precision of his attacks on Venezuelan operations suggested that someone with access to government databases, financial records, and law enforcement intelligence was feeding information to his operatives. The man who was supposed to be completely isolated from the outside world had somehow maintained connections that made him more dangerous in prison than he had been while free. The Venezuelan cartel's response to this systematic dismantling of their operations revealed the desperation that was beginning to consume their leadership. Instead of the calculated professionalism that had characterized their initial profit expansion into Mexican territory, they began employing increasingly reckless tactics that attracted unwanted government attention. Bombings in Caracas that killed innocent civilians, public executions that horrified even hardened criminals, and threats against government officials that crossed lines that had previously been respected. Intelligence agencies monitoring cartel communications intercepted messages that revealed growing discord within Venezuelan criminal leadership. Some members advocated for releasing Emma in hopes of ending El Chapo's campaign against their operations. Others argued for escalating the conflict by targeting additional members of his family. The unity that had driven their successful expansion was fracturing under the pressure of fighting an enemy who seemed capable of striking them anywhere in the world. What started as a calculated psychological attack against a caged king became the Venezuelan cartel's greatest miscalculation. El Chapo proved that concrete walls couldn't contain the loyalty he had built over decades, and that true power isn't measured by freedom, but by the willingness of others to risk everything for your cause. The man they thought was powerless had just reminded the criminal world why legends never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to rise again.